Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's not raining like we all expected it to, because we're all supposed to be here communing together. No one had to stay home because of the rain, so thanks so much for coming out. My name is Cheryl Odeleye, and I'm the president of the board of WRFG Radio. Thank you. As you know, we are a nonprofit independent radio station, a community-based radio station, and everybody except for 2 staff people volunteers at that station for free. We have about 130 air shifters, we have 14 board members, and we have assorted other volunteers, and everybody just volunteers at WRFG because they know how important we are. And we love having the opportunity to host Amy Goodman. She is truly a member of our extended family. I think some of you may know that she was the first, I'm going to have to read this, she was the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, for developing an innovative model of truly independent grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by the mainstream media. Now, doesn't that sound a lot like WRFG? So we are truly bound in our missions. I'm going to pass the program along to our station manager, Joan Baptist. But before that, I do that, I want to acknowledge that we have a state senator visiting with us this evening, Senator Ford. To thank First Iconium Church and Reverend Tim McDonald for letting us have this event here. Reverend McDonald is able to be here this evening because he's traveling, but he sends his best wishes. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joan Baptist, our station manager.
Being here tonight. I think tonight's program is truly going to be an historic event. Times they are changing for sure, not necessarily for the best. We live in a very difficult time for many people, not just here in the United States, but throughout the world. And knowledge is power. But it also takes organization to make it true power. And WRFG, does its best to try to bring knowledge and information to the public, to the people. This July we turn 44 years old. We're a progressive station. We're a progressive station in the state of Georgia, which hasn't always been easy, but people like you to make it possible. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. It's important that we see these type of events and all the demonstrations we go to, all the activities we go to, as chances to organize, because as I said, knowledge is power, but it takes organization to really change things. I wanted to kind of lay out a little bit about what the program is going to be tonight, but also one of the things that we'd like to do is pass around some clipboards and have you just fill out your name, email, phone number, whatever you want to fill out, so we can keep in touch. So the question of organizing and of giving voice can continue past this meeting here. So you'll see clipboards going back and forth, and that's what they're there for. And please take a minute and fill them out. That would be extremely helpful to everybody. As the program ends, the table out front that is an entry table is going to turn into a WRFG merchandise table. So take a look out there, and if you're passing by, and we'll have T-shirts and bumper stickers and things if you want to pick anything up. We had a very special person that was going to be with us tonight. I think he's probably on his way. Frank Hamilton, you're not here yet, are you? Or are you? No, okay. So when he gets here, we will integrate him into the program. But before we bring Amy up and Dennis up, we wanted to have somebody who is a true American hero, especially here in the Atlanta area, to come up and welcome everyone with a song, something that she wrote herself. For just such an occasion, a visit from Amy Goodman. And so at least with a sing-song.
In 2008, when Amy was here promoting her book at that time, she kept saying, "Break the silence." And I started writing the song, and it's turned into something that I need a lot of help on. So if you'll take your hands and just imagine that your silence, your voice has been in silence like this, everybody. And then imagine just break the silence. And then in your seat, you gotta get the hip action, but all around the world, a W circle. Break the silence in your neighborhood. Okay, this is American Sign Language. Break the silence deep inside your heart. Break the silence now. All right, so here we go. And anything that I say, I need you to answer me back, break the silence. We'll see how it goes. This is Craig Ray who's here. All right, so it goes like this. Break the silence all around the world. Break the silence in your neighborhood. Break the silence deep inside your heart. Break the silence now. When they tell you hush your mouth, break the silence. When they tell you don't speak out, break the silence. When they take away your books, break the silence. When your confidence is shook, break the silence. When they say don't trust each other, break the silence. When they say tell on your brother, break the silence. When they say give up the fight, break the silence. When you know about your rights, sing it with me, ready? Break the silence all around the world. Break the silence in your neighborhood. Break the silence deep inside your heart. Break the silence now. When they're trying to recruit you, break the silence. When they you're born with suture, break the silence. When you've lost all sense of hope, break the silence. At the end of your rope, break the silence. When the prison walls get higher, break the silence. When your case won't come to trial, break the silence. When they say you got it wrong, break the silence. When you need to sing your song, let me hear you. Break the silence all around the world. Break the silence in your neighborhood. Break the silence deep inside your heart. Break the silence now. When a few hold on to plenty, break the silence. When the many don't have any, break the silence. When they say it's dangerous, break the silence. When you're just too curious, break the silence. When they say your song is banned, break the silence. When they take away your land, break the silence.
story.
Break the silence.
When you need to shine your glory. One more time.
Break the silence all around the world. Break the silence in your neighborhood. Break the silence deep inside your heart. Break the silence now. Break the silence.
Yeah. Thank you, Elise. Okay, great way to start. We also, in addition to thanking Elise, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch the guitarist's name. Craig.
Right here.
Okay, thank you so much. We also wanted to thank all of our sponsors. This has been such a great event for us. We actually had 22 organizations to sign up as sponsors. I think that's phenomenal. I'm going to read out your names. I know you know and love each and every one of them, but I'm going to ask you to wait till I finish all the names before we do a round of roaring applause, okay? So the sponsors for this evening's event are the Atlanta chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, the Atlanta Friends Meeting Social Concerns Committee, Council on American Islamic Relations, Friends of the Congo, Georgia Equality, Georgia Peace and Justice Coalition, Georgia Stand Up, Georgia State AFL-CIO, Georgia Women's Action for New Directions, Grandmothers for Peace, Jess Crawford, Jewish Voices for Peace, Joining Hands for Justice in Palestine and Israel, Metro Atlanta Democratic Socialists of America, National Domestic Workers Alliance, Project South, Scalawag Magazine, Seven Onda Natural Foods Market, Sister Love Inc., Southern Center for Human Rights, and Truly Living Well. What a list, right? We are deeply, deeply grateful for each and every one of those sponsors. I'm going to introduce a gentleman. Last year, I did a really long introduction, and he said that was way too much, so this year I'm going to do a really short introduction. But this is an introduction of Dennis Moynihan. Dennis Moynihan has worked with Democracy Now! Since 2000. He is a best-selling author and a syndicated columnist with King Features. He lives in Colorado, where he founded community radio station KFFR 88.3 in the town of Winter Park. I think everybody probably knows Dennis by reputation, but if not, he's a delight, and he's going to come forward now and delight us.
And I appreciate that. I don't recall commenting on the length of last year's introduction, but I do appreciate being here and all of you coming out to hear Amy and to support WRFG, most importantly. I did found a community radio station, I would like to say in my spare time, but it's turned out to be a really all-consuming project, KFFR in Winter Park, and it only reinforces my understanding of just how much work goes into building and sustaining a community radio station. And I'm very fortunate to travel often with Amy to events like this, to see, to understand when Noam Chomsky says he can tell when he's speaking to a group where there is a community radio station. The size of the audience, the engagement of the public, the consistent level of the intensity of and level of the questions that he gets. He can just tell, and it's not an accident. And WRFG is a true gem in this amazing constellation of community stations across the U.S. So really, thank you so much for supporting the station, and thank you all the staff and volunteers of WRFG for being this incredibly important institution here in the South. It's really unique. So we're on a national tour. The occasion prompting it is the release of this paperback edition of our latest book, Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America. We'll be signing here until they turn the lights off. If you want to come and ask Amy a question later, or say hello, or have a book signed, we'll be here. I have to say, if you get 2 books tonight from Acapella Books, another great institution, you'll get a free DVD. It's an interview that Amy and Juan Gonzalez conducted with Noam Chomsky about 2 weeks ago. It's not kind of an extended 90-minute interview. So we offer that incentive both to share the content, but also it helps to create this ripple effect. And the books are kind of, they have a life of their own. They're durable, they change hands, they can traverse prison walls easier than we can. So it's something that gets out there and helps educate people about not only democracy now, but most importantly about the movements that we aspire to write about and that we try to cover every day on Democracy Now! And it is really the basis of our work at Democracy Now! We are a news program, and we consider social movements to be newsworthy. And that's kind of the big difference, I'd say, between a lot of the extremely well-funded corporate networks that tend to, well, you don't need to be told that what they focus on, news traffic, weather, traffic accidents, car chases, whether with OJ or other, but there's so much more that goes on in our society that gets neglected. And I think, Amy will talk at length about some of those movements and what inspires her, but it really is what we try to do every day on Democracy Now! So we're really thankful that WRFG brings it to their listening audience every day at 5, and I guess Amy and I were trying to get here for a 6 o'clock reception with, among others, the amazing group of co-sponsors of this event. And so thanks to, I guess, a bridge collapse, we were able to spend a lot of time in the car. And so, heard the show and really this incredibly creative and wonderful promos for tonight's event with some of the sponsors describing their work and why they love WRFG. So thanks to all those organizations as well. We just came from Tampa. We heard on the show today, if you heard it or watched it, from is his first name Gilbert? Rich, who wrote a book, The Devil in the Grove, and it was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book of history published in 2013. And we happened to be in Tampa. This is a story of a racist sheriff and prosecutor in the 40s who targeted young African-American men with the all too familiar false charge of rape of a young white woman, and the efforts of a young lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, to help save them from the electric chair. It's a really gripping story, and it happened not too far from where we were this morning in Tampa. And I just can't reiterate enough how important it is to have institutions like People TV and WRFG to keep those stories alive and to document what's happening now. Because when I was listening to the interview this morning, and we did some preparation for the interview yesterday, just how similar these acts of racism and state violence, whether through sheriffs, police, or through prosecutorial vindictiveness. It has a slightly different presentation in the modern era, perhaps, but it really is so similar, and that's, I think, what I've often been very pleased with the way Amy and the producers will go back in history and bring in a lot of these incredibly relevant stories of just the number of martyrs in the cause of civil rights and so many other movements that we write about in the book. It just is, it's a difficult topic, a difficult content to kind of have to immerse ourselves in every day, but so important. And I have to say, Amy is tireless, courageous. I first heard Democracy Now! In 1996 when I was caretaking a small island off the coast of Maine. And WERU was one of the first stations that carried Democracy Now! I don't know if WRFG was among the first 9 stations that carried the show, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was not the first 9, it was one of the first stations. And 1996, I was kind of commuted to and from shore with a sea kayak when I needed groceries and paddled to an island 3 miles farther out to access a payphone at the time. So it was a very isolating work commitment I made. But the WERU brought a whole range of programming to that little island, and it included Democracy Now! In its first summer. So I was very grateful to have that access to the wider world, to the daily news. It inspired me. My activism led me to participate in organizing a protest against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. And it was there that I first met Amy and Juan Gonzalez and Jeremy Scahill. And I was part of a small working group that was doing media relations for the direct action that shut down the WTO meeting. And that we had a lot of difficulty getting fair and accurate coverage from the corporate press. And so to have the consistent, excellent coverage of Democracy Now! During that week of protests was so important. And it also demonstrated clearly, what I've come to know just as an absolute truth, that Amy Goodman is one of the most courageous journalists I've ever met, and actually one of the most courageous people I've met. She was out there in the midst of what was a really unrestrained police riot in the streets of Seattle, with clouds of tear gas, flashbang grenades, rubber-coated steel ball bullets being fired, in huge numbers. And in the midst of all that, Amy going right up to the riot police, not only covering their violence, but also asking them questions. They had gas masks on. She was in that, terrible chemical clouds, unprotected. And withal, she managed to do great reporting. That hasn't stopped. In the book, we have at least a page summary of the many arrests and detentions, interrogations that she's suffered in the course of her work. I've been witness to many of them, a real violent arrest in 2008 at the Republican National Convention, arbitrarily detained and harassed and interrogated by entering our friendly neighbor to the north, Canada. It seems every time we go into Canada, they're very curious at the border about what she's going to be speaking about. I think they probably have better issues to focus on, but the experiences we had last Labor Day weekend covering the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance, the water protectors at Standing Rock. Amy will talk about that, but coincident with her her courage, there's a very deep well of humility, and she's so humble. And so I'm going to have to be the one to announce that Democracy Now! Just last Monday was awarded this very prestigious, one of the top honors in journalism from the Society of Professional Journalists. It's called the Sigma Delta Chi Award. And it's in the category of television breaking news, and I know it's not something that, it's kind of a specialty in the news industry when you have a lot of trucks and helicopters and a whole fleet of vehicles. You're out dispatching camera people and reporters to the scene of breaking news. We happen to be in a very distant place along this lonely road when the Dakota Access Pipeline Company and its hired agents unleashed dogs on nonviolent resistors and documented that and turned it around quickly and got it out to the wider audience. And so to see the juxtaposition of Democracy Now! In the list of award winners of this SPJ Sigma Delta Chi Award, it's the CBS Evening News, now with Scott Pelley, the NBC Nightly News, ABC News with Diane Sawyer, these kind of immensely well-positioned and infinitely financed news operations that typically win this award. And so to have an independent news production like Democracy Now! In there, it shows both the sensibility and the hard work that Amy and her colleagues do every day, but also that the new media, this kind of new non-commercial, non-profit, intrepid sector that's growing and expanding and harnessing all the tools that are available, actually can compete and do as good or better than these incumbent establishment organizations. So I think it's a very good sign. And we have a lot of bad signs in the journalism world, in the media world. The FCC chairman now, Ajit Pai, has basically signaled that there is no level of media consolidation that he won't support. And the FCC functions, a lot like Congress. It's a fixed Republican majority, and they can just pass whatever they want. Obviously, there's resistance to all these new regressive policies that are being rammed through, and we at Democracy Now! Are going to continue to cover that, partnering with WRFG and independent videographers here, so we learn more about issues like a tent city that's happening here, and we've covered it. There's so many people to thank. It's I couldn't even begin. But again, Heather Gray has been such a solid ally in our work and at WRFG. And competing with Amy on the humility scale is a friend of the show and a friend of WRFG, Jess Crawford, who's in the room. I want to thank Jess. So with that, I just want to hand over the mic. I think, who's it going to now? Okay, so we're going to hand it to Joan for a quick announcement, and then a esteemed colleague and winner of the Sigma Delta Chi Breaking News Award for 2016.
Without further ado, let's hear the very courageous Amy Goodman.
It is so great to be here to celebrate WRFG, to celebrate these remarkable years, and to be here with the founder, Harlan Joy, of our WRFG, Radio Station. It's wonderful to see people we cover in the audience, like Sharice Brown. And to show the level of resistance that's on the ground everywhere. Yes, here in Atlanta and all over the country. I don't think we've seen anything like this in a very long time. The media has been focusing on the first 100 days of Donald Trump, and I think that's very important to evaluate as he tries to and is moving at a very rapid speed to deregulate the state, to dismantle the regulatory state. And if that sounds a little bureaucratic, what does it mean when the state regulates? It's about the air we breathe, the water we drink. It's about people having access to health care and education, what we consider fundamental rights. It is so important to follow what actually is happening right now in this country, but it is also important to follow the resistance that is so remarkable since Donald Trump was inaugurated, the next day, the images coming out, he had a respectable crowd, 180,000 people who came out, but when the images were shown of President Obama's 9 years before, that 180,000 was about 10% of the size of President Obama's inaugural crowd, 1.8 million people in 2009. It just infuriated President Trump. And so he sent out his White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, to simply lie and to say this was the largest inaugural crowd ever. But even that controversy obscured what happened the very next day, on January 21st, when 3 times the crowd, from just the day before the inauguration, came out to protest Donald Trump. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps 500, 600,000 women and their allies speaking about the resistance that they would begin. And that was just in Washington, D.C., where we broadcast for hours. I spoke to Kerry Washington of Scandal. I saw her at the Sundance Film Festival. If you're regular viewers and listeners of Democracy Now!, that we cover the documentary film track every year of Sundance. And so I went out to Sundance soon after that. Kerry Washington was there, and she had just spoken at the Los Angeles women's protest. 750,000 people came out. This cannot be minimized. It is truly astounding. And while President Trump asks who's paying for all of this, because that's on his mind, he projects his own experience onto others. When he announced for president, he paid actors to be there at the Trump Tower and to applaud as he announced his candidacy. What we are seeing is both organized response and just a massive outflow of horror, anger, and determination. After that, you had the very quick succession of executive orders, including Muslim Ban 1 and then Muslim Ban 2. Muslim Ban 1 said that refugees could not come from 7 Muslim-majority countries. The response that night was just amazing. That happened on a Friday night. On Saturday, the ACLU went to court in Brooklyn. And when the lawyer came out of the courtroom, he said there were 1,000 people outside the courthouse. He was shocked, but that was just at the courthouse. At JFK, thousands of people turned out. At Dulles Airport, you had a senator, a judge. They were being manhandled by security. LAX, Los Angeles Airport. People standing up for other people. I'm a Jewish American, and my family, some survived the Holocaust, some didn't make it. but I certainly know the stories of the voyage of the damned, for example, that ship that came along the shores of the United States that FDR turned back, filled with hundreds of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. And we know what happened to them when they returned. Or Anne Frank, whose father, Otto Frank, applied several times to save his family from the Nazis. They were hiding out in an attic, and the US government said no. Refugees are the symbol of this country. I live in New York, the Statue of Liberty with her torch, saying, all who suffer, come here. This is the best of America. And after Muslim ban 1 was stayed, President Trump's comment about the judge in Seattle, where we'll be on Wednesday night at Seattle Town Hall, the so-called judge that stayed the Muslim ban, that's what President Trump called him. You know, as the CEO of a real estate empire, he is not used to those below him saying no and him having to abide by what they say. Is he the janitor, this judge? You know, that is his view. Truly, we are engaged in a nationwide civics lesson. It is astounding. From 5th graders to kindergartners, and we hope it will include the President of the United States soon. Understanding we have 4 equal branches of government. The judiciary, the executive, the legislative, and yes, a judge can stay your efforts, can be a check on power. And then you had just last week the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, on a right-wing radio talk show, saying about the second ban, you know, the second Muslim ban, 6 Muslim majority nations, refugees not allowed into the United States, stayed by a judge in Hawaii. And so Jeff Sessions said, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? I think maybe one group that felt very encouraged by Attorney General Sessions' comments was the sovereignty movement in Hawaii. They really want nothing to do with the United States, and are probably saying. And as we've traveled around this country, we began in Denver doing a fundraiser for the independent newspaper, television, radio. We did the event at Su Teatro Performing Arts Center, a local community Latino center. And the next morning we went to the Unitarian Church, and it's wonderful to be here at First Iconium. It's a real honor. We were in a Unitarian church in the morning to meet Jeanette Vizgara. Jeanette is a mother of 4. She's a Mexican immigrant. She's lived here for more than 20 years. And after President Trump was inaugurated, and she saw that Danielle Ramirez in Washington State was arrested, who was a dreamer, who was DACA, legally here, allowed to work and to live, and yet he was arrested. She got scared. Her older daughter is also a dreamer. Her 3 youngest are American citizens, and she took refuge in the church. So many churches in this country have opened their doors as sanctuary. And we interviewed her when she jumped into the church in February through Skype, and I was in New York through the TV studio, but now I was in Denver and wanted to meet her and see how it was after 2 months there. She'd received a lot of death threats, and I asked her what gave her hope, and she said, because there's so many more people who are showing their support. They far outnumber the people who threaten me. Now, she can't step outside of the church afraid ICE will arrest her. So the police chief of Denver came to her to express his support, to say, if you feel threatened, you call me. The mayor of Denver has expressed his support. The local congressman, Jared Polis, has expressed his support for Jeanette Vigueras. So we sat in the basement, her kids were just waking up, and she talked about, she said, I so appreciate people helping me. I don't stop working, she said, from morning until night for other people. I'm just doing it inside the church. And then Zuri, her 6-year-old girl, came and sat on her lap, and Roberto, her 10-year-old boy. He was a feather of a boy, speaks perfect English, very slight. And as soon as he came in, he put his arm around his mother and he wouldn't let go. And he held up a poster that his teacher had made. He goes to public school in Denver, a lithograph of his mother and the beautiful Mayan features, and it says, "Keep families united." He was going to take that poster and walk with Zuri and other Jeanette supporters in the Cesar Chavez March that day, and he was getting ready. And he told me, my mother cannot step outside, so I am my mother's voice. So, in the next days, we ran the interview with Roberto and with Jeanette. And the next day, Time magazine came out with its 100 most important people in the world. You know, Jeanette Vigueras was one of them. And she held a news conference outside the church, inside the church, because she couldn't leave, and she held up her 2016 tax returns. And she said, I share these with you. I pay taxes every single year, and I challenge the president to do the same. So just a few days ago, Time magazine had its big gala in New York. You might have heard John Legend had some choice words for the president there, and other glitterati were there. Of course, Jeanette could not risk going because she could be arrested. So folks held a gala for her in the church, and they had their celebration. That was last Tuesday night. On Wednesday morning, Arturo Hernandez Garcia was arrested on the streets of Denver. Now, I met Arturo in 2015 in the same church with his little daughter. He had taken refuge there, an immigrant who'd worked here for well over a decade and was married and had 2 children. And he wouldn't leave the church until, at the time, the Obama administration gave him a document that said he is not a priority for deportation. And then he said he wanted to come out of the shadows and give, and in good faith, show other immigrants that they shouldn't be afraid. And so, armed with that letter, he's been working for another 2 years with his brother-in-law. They run a tile business together. And on the Wednesday morning, after the gala for Jeanette Vigueras, that ICE could not enter and take her, they took someone else on the streets of Denver. They took Arturo. American Friends Service Committee had been deeply involved with both of their cases. And Jennifer Piper, who came on Democracy Now!, a young woman who's been very active on this issue, she called ICE and she said, what are you doing? You know that Arturo has a letter. And the letter says he is not a priority for deportation. And ICE responded to her by saying, that was an old administration. This is a new one. We have no priorities. An interesting way to put it. And so he's been taken. And then we were in Burlington, Vermont. And in a church, another Unitarian church, but it kind of looked like this. And I looked over on the side, and there was Zuli Palacios and Kike Bacazar. They are 2 immigrants who are very active and well known in the Burlington group called Migrant Justice. And they are deeply involved with ensuring, like the Immokalee workers, that tomato pickers would get a fair price for their labor. They're involved in Vermont in the dairy farms. You know, from Vermont to California, the large farms are highly dependent on migrant labor. In fact, in California, the large growers are talking about a labor drought right now. But Zuli and Kike are very well known. They were picked up a few weeks ago by ICE. They were arrested, they were held for almost 2 weeks, but there was such tremendous outcry that they were released. Is the federal government hunting down activists? Yes. Are they targeting people who are standing up not only for themselves, but for others? Going after the most vulnerable? You know, it made me think about my colleague Juan Gonzalez, who I have had the honor of working with for all 21 years of Democracy Now! Juan is a great journalist, and he just retired from the New York Daily News, where he was a columnist for 29 years. There were so many retirement parties for him. I mean, I might have even been here last year. I was getting texts on the phone nonstop about these parties. I couldn't be there because I was on the road. And there was a party at the Francis Tavern, this historic place in Lower Manhattan, and who would say, Mayor de Blasio has just left the party and Governor Cuomo has just entered. You know, they wouldn't be seen together because they hate each other. But, and then, Senator Schumer has just come into the party, and I'm getting all these pictures and saying, wait a second, we are not supposed to be cozying up to those in power. Why are all of these political leaders celebrating Juan? But then I came to the conclusion that they actually were coming to this retirement party to ensure with their own eyes that he would finally leave and stop dogging them. And then Juan was inducted. He was the first Latino journalist inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. And we all went to the luncheon for him. Oh, he was inducted with Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl and Max Frankel of the New York Times, but his speech put the others to shame. He talked about his quarter of a century as a columnist and said, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change. Not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. I have tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. I prefer the desperate, unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. I think that's very much the philosophy of Democracy Now! To go to where the silence is, which is why we went to North Dakota last Labor Day weekend. So it all began centuries before, but on April 1st, 2016, thank you. Does someone want to taste test this, or, okay. Not taste test, but okay, I'll trust her now. Thank you. We went to North Dakota in September, but it began on April 1st when the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, opened her property to the resistance. They were fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, the $3.8 billion pipeline that Energy Transfer Partners owns. And they want to extend this pipeline, taking the fracked oil from the North Dakota Bakken oil fields through South Dakota, through Iowa to Illinois, and hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. It would go under the Missouri River, which is the longest river in North America. And the Standing Rock Sioux tribe said no. Said this would endanger the water of 17 million people downstream, natives and non-natives alike. Now, they were not alone in saying no. The people of Bismarck, the capital, said no. The people of Mandan, North Dakota, said no. And the pipeline company respected this. So why not respect the Native Americans? And so LaDonna Brapel Allard opened her property. Scores of people came, then hundreds. That property couldn't contain all of the people who were there to fight back, not only against this one particular pipeline, but for a sustainable society, for a society that is not based on fossil fuels. You know, interestingly, we just did a big 20th anniversary event for Democracy Now! And 2,500 people came out to Riverside Church in New York. Riverside Church this past week, with its massive fortune, said it would no longer invest in fossil fuels and fossil fuels. Riverside Church was built by the son of John Rockefeller, who was the founder of Standard Oil. Riverside Church, where Dr. King spoke 50 years ago, April 4th, 1967. April 4th, on that day, 3,000 people packed into the church, and he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech. Even his inner circle said, don't make this speech. You've got the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson at the time, wrapped around your finger. You got him to sign the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Don't alienate him. This war is not your war. And Dr. King said no. He saw a deep connection between the war at home and the war abroad. And so he addressed the thousands of people. And he talked about the triple threat of extreme materialism, militarism, and racism. And he went on to talk about the country he loved, the United States. And he said it's the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Now, for young people who are here, if you think it's easy for him to say something like that, because he was an icon, you know, he was untouchable, he could say anything. But that's not true. He was under enormous pressure. After that speech, the mainstream media excoriated him. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Life magazine. I have the Life magazine. It said that his speech sounded like a script out of Radio Hanoi. They said he had done a disservice to his cause, his country, and his people. He just doubled down. He continued to speak out ever more ferociously. And 1 year later, to the day, April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, he was gunned down at the Lorraine Motel. And he really was one of the fathers of what we call today intersectional politics, linking all of the different issues, from militarism abroad to poverty at home, to labor and economic and racial justice. I mean, think why he was in Memphis. He was simply there to stand with sanitation workers who were trying to organize a local of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Activism, building movements, this is what makes this country great. And one other thing I want to say about war right now. You know, when Donald Trump became president, and I even hesitate to say this out loud, but he started, well before, years before, attacking the press, viciously attacking the press. You know, he calls the press the enemy of the people, the enemy of the American people. This is so destabilizing as he goes after the checks and balances on power. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. My brother David and I wrote a book called Static, and our first book was called The Exception to the Rulers. That's what we're supposed to be. Static, because even in this high-def digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Now, Donald Trump has been attacking the media. And you know, if you tune into Democracy Now!, how many of you tune in one way or another? How many of you listen on WRFG? How many of you tune into People TV? How many of you watch at democracynow.org or listen or read? Oh, one other thing, we're sending around the Daily Digest so you can get our news headlines and our news alerts. I hope that you will sign up for that. You can also do it right from your phone. And you can do it by just texting the word Democracy Now!, one word, just Democracy Now!, no space. Democracy Now! To 66866. And that will sign you up, and we'll be in touch every day with our news headlines and our features. And we're really looking forward tomorrow to doing the broadcast from here. But Donald Trump started attacking the media and has not let up. And I hesitate to say this, but I really wondered, I mean, if he just stopped, the media has found its backbone. I mean, it has been hit so hard every day. It's talking about being essential to the functioning of a democratic society. It's so important that the media says that they are supposed to be the check and balance on power. If Donald Trump just stopped attacking them for a few days, they would wrap themselves around him. That's what the establishment media has historically done, protected the establishment. And that is what he is right now. And if he would only stop doing this, this is why I am concerned, is that, yes, he will understand that they want to be inside players when we're supposed to be outside, not a party to the parties. The president is now suffering from the lowest popularity ratings of any president in history. That sends a chill through me. Because when a president is so deeply unpopular, he's going to look for an external enemy to deflect attention. And we see it happening. And this also ties into the media that has been very critical of Donald Trump. So he looks for an outside enemy. And, you know, it's like the whole country is suffering from whiplash. It's North Korea, it's Iran, it's Syria. And he is ramping up in the one case of North Korea. I mean, North Korean leaders have been saying militaristic, threatening things for a very long time. But presidents put them in perspective. If you were to highlight any one of the comments, you would be afraid. And that's what's happening right now. He will find a pretext. And he has said very clearly that, a military option is possible. So that's what's happening abroad. And it's not just saying it. I mean, the bombs that were dropped, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, 59 slammed into an air base in Syria after the gas attack. That gas attack needs to be investigated, but what did these Tomahawk missiles do but perhaps enrich him personally? You know that he has investments in Raytheon, which makes the missiles. At least he did in the last documents we've seen about his own finances, and we should see them all so we can understand if that's what's dictating foreign policy and what's domestic. The air base was operating the next day. What was the point? Except to send a message, I think, way outside of Syria. And then dropping the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on Afghanistan. It's called the Moab. The Pentagon nicknamed it the mother of all bombs, the massive ordnance air blast. Its blast radius something like a mile. It was developed under President Bush. He didn't dare use it. President Obama didn't use it. And Donald Trump, within weeks of his presidency, drops this massive bomb. And within a few days of taking office, he strikes Yemen and kills, I don't know how many women and children, and also a U.S. Navy SEAL. When the father of that Navy SEAL went to Dover to receive his son's body, he was horrified when he heard that President Trump was there as well and refused to shake his hand or to greet him, asking about the fiasco that was that attack. And so we see the externalizing of the enemy and also internalizing it, finding enemies here at home, whether it's Mexicans who, within his first utterances, as he ran for president, talked about Mexicans as rapists, or whether it's Muslims. You never know who the next enemy, or whether it's the media. What do they all have in common? Mexicans, media, Muslims. Okay, maybe we're safe. Montana better watch out. Finding someone or an entity or a country to attack. And, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Long before he was president, Donald Trump led the birther movement in this country to try to delegitimize President Obama, to say he wasn't born in this country, to say that he was a secret Muslim. Now, this involves a lot of issues. He has raised this for years, says he has the smoking gun, he sent investigators to Hawaii. I mean, he attacks the media as fake news. It takes one to know one. And it was so much deeper than just saying he wasn't a citizen of the United States. I think very much it's about the othering of people who don't look like him, right? Clearly, the message was sent out far and wide, and I think it's the reason why the Ku Klux Klan endorsed Donald Trump, why David Duke endorsed Donald Trump. And on the issue of he's a secret Muslim, what are you supposed to say to that? Oh no, he's not a Muslim. Just put in any religion. Don't worry, he's not Jewish. I can tell you he's not a Hindu, and I'm sure he's not a Christian. What does it mean to have to even say that? Except simply we care about the truth. And we know what Donald Trump tried to do for so long, how he built his base, how he built this foundation. But I want to go back to the voices of dissent. The people that he has gathered around him in Washington. It's so clear what he is doing. Right, the development in Washington of the oligarchy. You've got Rex Tillerson, who is now the Secretary of State, the former CEO of the largest oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, who has hid human-induced climate change and its effects for so many decades, doing some of the best research on it to the credit of Exxon, and then covering it up, and now being investigated by a number of attorneys general around the United States. Did Exxon break laws? But what we do know is that the former CEO of Exxon, who stepped down just to become Secretary of State, is now in one of the most powerful positions in the United States. And then there's Scott Pruitt, the former Oklahoma Attorney General. Oklahoma, which knew almost no earthquakes, is now a land of quakes from fracking. He sued the EPA 14 times, tries to eviscerate this agency. Now he's in charge of the agency he wants to destroy. We just did a 5-hour broadcast from the March for Science in Washington on Earth Day, April 22nd. A large contingent of those who marched were the workers at the EPA, deeply alarmed that they were committing their lives to protecting the environment of this country, and now all of that they fear is being shut down. In fact, on that day, and the day before it was announced, or you could just see it on the EPA website, they removed any references to climate change. And then there's Governor Rick Perry of Texas, who ran for president twice and was bankrolled to the tune of $6 million by Kelsey Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when Governor Perry stepped down as governor, he immediately went onto the board of Energy Transfer Partners, stepped down only to become Secretary of Energy, which is what he's doing now. And so the people of North Dakota have a mighty force that they have to contend with. But let me just talk about this last year and how it came to what we see today. LaDonna Brave Allard opens her property to the resistance. More and more resistance camps are built over the next few months. Scores and then hundreds of people are arrested, native and non-native alike, resisting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. We went on Labor Day weekend. Even that was late. We were reporting on it before, but we actually went on the ground on that weekend. And at that point, people were performing ceremonies. They were marching in these back prairie roads, and they would confront these militarized sheriff's departments. I mean, what are rural sheriff's departments doing with MRAPs and tanks? I mean, this is recycling in America today. You take the hardware and the weapons from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you give them to the police departments of this country. We saw this very clearly with the uprising after 18-year-old African-American teenager Michael Brown was gunned down by a Ferguson police officer. The uprising met by this massive force of the Ferguson Police Department and other police departments. And we see it in North Dakota. And to see these marches, they are so deeply inspiring. They'll be led by the elders, often female elders, indigenous leaders. And as they come up on the kind of RoboCop wall that faces them, often they will have a glass of water and say, this is for your children, not just for ours. This is what we are protecting. You know, they don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. And that's what we covered that weekend. On the Saturday of that weekend, we followed a group of Native Americans. They didn't think that the Dakota Access Pipeline construction was going to be happening. It was a holiday weekend. They were going to plant their native flags on their sacred burial grounds. Now, a few days before, a judge had asked the Standing Rock Sioux for a map. He said, if you say it's your sacred burial ground where DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, wants to build, prove it. show me a map of just where those burial mounds are. And so the Standing Rock Sioux did. They gave it to the judge, he gave it to Energy Transfer Partners. And on that Saturday, when the Native Americans came up to plant the flags, they believed, I mean, the bulldozers had been way down the road, that they leapfrogged over, moved way forward in their construction to particularly target the sites on the map that they had drawn. Because the judge would be ruling the next week, and if they changed the facts on the ground, it would be a moot point. So the Native Americans came up on this property and they see the bulldozers operating at full tilt. And they were shocked. And first a mother and her child and then others came up on the property. They stood in front of the bulldozers and they said, stop. Now this is very frightening. It's amazingly brave. I can only think, I mean, these are massive bulldozers. And they are churning the earth. It's incredibly dangerous. I thought back to March 16, 2003. That was 3 days before the US invaded Iraq. And it was in a different place. It was in Rafah. It was in Gaza, in the occupied territories. And I thought of a young American woman named Rachel Corrie. Rachel was a college student at Evergreen in Washington State. And she went to Gaza and part of the International Solidarity Movement to bear witness. And she befriended a pharmacist family. And it looked like that pharmacist's house was about to be bulldozed by an Israeli military bulldozer that's made by Caterpillar in the United States. And she stood in front of it along with other activists, and they were wearing these, orange fluorescent vests like construction workers wear. And she tried to stop the bulldozer, and she was crushed to death by the bulldozer. And that's what I thought of when I thought of these women and children standing in front of these massive machines. But this time they won. They succeeded in forcing the bulldozers back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They all started moving back, and hundreds of people were moving forward. And that's when the Dakota Access Pipeline Guards unleashed the dogs on the Native Americans. They released dogs. Even the dogs would pull back, and they would throw them into the crowd, and they'd have to bite their way out of it. And we filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. This whole scene, we filmed people who were bitten, people who were maced, who were pepper sprayed, and we immediately put it online that night. Now, I want to be clear, this is in the midst of the presidential election. In the election season, with the major presidential debates, did one of these, I don't know if you can call them journalists, let's call them media personalities, did one of them ask the presidential candidate about climate change? Not one. In the media says they talk about what people are interested in. Really? We posted this video online that night. Within 48 hours, there were 14 million views. I think people are interested. So, we flew back to New York, had to continue to do Democracy Now!, our daily news hour. Of course, the sheriffs weren't there, but they only took the narrative of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this was the only verification of what had happened. The judge was going to rule that week, that Friday, and things were getting very tense. And on Thursday night, the governor, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple, called out the National Guard. The judge would be ruling about 5 o'clock on Friday. Oh, the authorities did one other thing. They issued an arrest warrant for me, but I didn't know it at the time. So then we come to Friday, and the judge rules at about 5 o'clock, and he rules against the trial. The Justice Department, I should say Obama was in Asia that week, his first trip to Laos, and in Laos he held a democracy forum, invited students from Asia around the continent. And I think it was the last young person to ask a question with this young woman from Malaysia. And she raised her hand and said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? She asked a question that no American journalist had publicly asked President Obama. This young woman who had come to Laos to get a lesson in democracy. She said, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? And the president held forth. President Obama actually was very eloquent in talking about the centuries of oppression that Native Americans face. And then he actually went on to address her question. He said, I'd have to ask my team about it. I don't have the latest on this. And word has it, he did come back to he came back to the United States that week. It was right before the judge ruled. And word has it, he saw the video. He saw the video of the dogs. It wasn't lost on the first African-American president. What did Winona LaDuke say that day of the dogs when we interviewed her? She said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama. It is not 1965. We are through. Justice Department wins against the tribe. This is Obama's Justice Department. But 15 minutes later, as the Justice Department lawyers are about to pop the champagne corks, an unprecedented 3-agency letter from Department of Interior, from the Army Corps of Engineers, and from the very Justice Department that had just prevailed over the tribe, said they were going to stop. The Native Americans did not understand what hit them. No one else did either. First, the worst decision possible against them. Then 15 minutes later, the government says they're not going to move forward, not grant the permits at this moment, that they would look further into whether there was proper Native input and whether there was an environmental impact statement. This was a huge deal. So on that Friday, we went up to Canada. We weren't fleeing. But we went to the Toronto International Film Festival because a new film premiered about the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And he told young people, young journalists, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. And he said, if you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the film, All Governments Lie. It's the story of I.F. Stone, but then it also talks about independent media organizations today, like Democracy Now! And so Nermeen Sheikh and I went up, like Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, so he came up. And I went up because I thought it was important to speak after the film about what we just experienced in North Dakota. People in Canada care about First Nations. And the next day we were all invited to the University of Toronto, and it was a crowd like this, and we each spoke, and I was in the middle of my speech, and that's when I got the text that said, you're under arrest. And so I was sitting there, and I was giving the speech. I got a little bit distracted. And it said something like, there's an arrest warrant for you. I didn't recognize the number. I was sure it was a scam, but then I saw that number, that's North Dakota. It turns out it was a North Dakota lawyer, and I knew I was in trouble. So I didn't want to say anything because it's not like you'll just be picked up immediately, right? If you're just walking down the street, if there's an arrest warrant for you. But if you have an interaction with police or the FBI or border guards, that's when you're going to be in trouble. And I was in Canada. I had to go over the border. So if I could possibly do this before the arrest warrant got into the system, and so I was thinking about all this as I was giving the speech, and then I just sort of gave up and said, could someone call a cab? I didn't say I was going to the airport, but I raced to the airport and made it over the border and went back to New York, and we continued to broadcast Democracy Now!, but we knew we had to challenge this arrest warrant. I didn't take it personally. I think it was a clear message for journalists around the country: do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we had to go to North Dakota. And I especially cared about young journalists who, how can they afford this? How can they go to North Dakota and think they're going to be arrested? That it's so important to understand you don't have to get a record if you want to put things on the record. So we returned a few weeks later to call their bluff. This was absolutely ridiculous and very dangerous to the functioning of a democratic society. So we flew into Bismarck on a Friday afternoon, and as we landed, the prosecutor announced he would drop the charges against me. And then said he would up the charges, charge me anew, this time with riot. Like I'm a one-woman riot. So I would face a year in jail. And they said I would be arraigned Monday at 1:30. This was Friday afternoon, so it gave us plenty of time to cover the protest that weekend. And we continued to cover the protest, and then on Monday morning, the show must go on, and we had to do the broadcast. So we broadcast in front of the Mandan jail and courthouse, where I would have to turn myself in. They're connected on the public property, the jail, the courthouse, and the 10 Commandments in between. So we positioned ourselves across the street on church property. We opened the floodlights just before 7. We broadcast at 8 every morning. You can check it out at democracynow.org, but 7 North Dakota time. I think the police didn't know what to do. Like, it is illegal to turn on the light. But we did the show. And we interviewed Dave Archibald, the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux. He'd been arrested. It was his first arrest. He was charged with a low-level misdemeanor for civil disobedience. He was strip searched. He was put in an orange jumpsuit, and he was jailed. We interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She's the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. She was one of the first to be arrested, right? She cares about the health of the children on the reservation. She was strip searched. She was put in an orange jumpsuit. She was jailed. How much humiliation can a people take? I bumped into one of the guards at the site Labor Day weekend in one of my, when I was at the airport in North Dakota in one of my trips. And he came over to me, I was like reading a magazine or something, and he came over and he said, "Don't think I don't know who you are." And I said, I guess the video had gone out. And he said, "I was there." And I said, "Did you unleash the dogs?" He said, "No. There were different companies that were employed by the Dakota Access Pipeline Company. We did not know dogs were going to be brought onto the site. We too were horrified." And he said, "Don't think I don't know how they feel when we sick dogs on them and what we've done to them, the massacres for hundreds of years. I get it. Never assume who will be for you and who will be against you." So we did the broadcast, and there was so much attention now because a journalist was being arraigned. Oh, we did one other thing. I asked, now what happens? I want to know every bit of the process. I'll just be arraigned at 1:30, or does a human being intervene before that? He said, no, the lawyers say it's absolutely, you get arraigned. And then I said, but does someone intervene before? He said, well, the judge signs off. It's absolutely pro forma, 100% of the time, signs off on all the charges. And then in the trial, they use their discretion. I said, wait a second, a judge has to sign off on the charges for the arraignment? That's a human being. That's the pressure point. So we issued a press release that named the judge, and then we said he would be deciding that weekend whether or not he would allow the charges to move forward into an arraignment. And when we got that specific, all of the media came out, or called in, and called up the judge and called the authorities. And I mean, it was the New York Times, it was the Los Angeles Times, it was Al Jazeera, it was on the BBC homepage. I mean, it was Vogue. I have to spiff up my act. And the judge decided not to move forward with the charges, so there would be no arraignment. By then, hundreds of Native Americans had come to show their solidarity, but also there were a number of Native Americans, Standing Rock Sioux, Cheyenne River, and others, who were being arraigned that day as well, on felonies and misdemeanors. And a number of those charges were dropped as well. It really shows how it matters when the media spotlight shines in the right direction. I am all for reality television, not the kind we have in this country, but for the TV that shows the reality on the ground. It is absolutely critical. It is what will save us. To be able to express that dissent. Because the hope is what's happening on the ground around this country. I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about inequality and the growing inequality in this country, those who are concerned about racial, economic, and social justice, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. So that was in October. December 5th, the Obama administration released another 3-agency letter saying they would not move ahead with the pipeline. They would not grant that permit to go under the Missouri River. It was an enormous deal that either it wouldn't be built or there would be some kind of rerouting. They would be consulting with the tribe. But then, when Donald Trump became president, one of his first executive orders was to move ahead with the Dakota Access Pipeline, to grant that permit, and also to revive the Keystone XL pipeline, which had been killed years ago. Not because President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wanted to kill the pipeline, but because of the enormous pressure on them by people all over this country. And that too would be revived. So the pipeline has been built. It's still going through a legal process, but as so many of the Native Americans who came to the People's Climate March said, no oil has flown yet. And that is very significant. And there is not only a national but a global divestment campaign that is targeting banks like Wells Fargo and Bank of America and really focusing on the financial institutions that allow the fossil fuel economy to continue. And universities are under enormous fire by students and staff to stop investing in a dying economy. Ultimately, we cannot depend on this. It's just a matter of how long it will take to convince these very powerful institutions. But there is a force more powerful, and it is everyone. It is everyone together. And it is also, what's so amazing about it, is those that fight for a sustainable economy and environment are also saving the very people who are fighting against them, because we all live as one ultimately on this planet. Now, I talked about the resistance to the Keystone XL a few years ago. They're reviving that too. And I wanted to talk about this global resistance to fossil fuels. You know, we cover every climate summit, from Copenhagen to Cancun, from Durban to Doha, from Poland to Peru to Paris this past year. We'll go to Bonn this year. And you might say, why waste the fuel? What happens at these UN climate summits? It's not the people that gather inside. It's the people, the thousands of people who are outside, who are from the most vulnerable places on earth. Like in Copenhagen, a 15-year-old boy from the Maldives looked into our camera and said, "You are drowning my country. Or the people of sub-Saharan Africa who say, you are cooking our continent. And so many people to come to these summits, many get arrested, they are protesting, but there was a breach in South Africa, in Durban in 2011. Young people were invited inside to address the world body. It was at the end of the summit, and the young people chose as their spokesperson a college student, a young woman named Anjali Apadarai from College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine. And she got up on the stage and she looked out on the august body of diplomats, world leaders, scientists, bureaucrats, and she said, I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money. You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then as she ended, she quoted Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And so she looked out on the crowd and said, so distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. And so many of those in the audience, who she and so many young people, indigenous people, people from the most targeted areas of the planet, they clapped, they applauded, and the president of the COP, that's the Conference of Parties, the UN Summit, actually said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. So the following year in Doha, I saw Anjali again. She was outside. And I said, oh, are you coming in? And she said, no, I've been banned. But the resistance goes on. And I just want to end with one last brief story. And also say that Dennis and I will be signing books, and I hope that you come up, and you don't have to get any book, or if you want to get one book or 2 books, we are offering, we have these 2 DVDs. One is our Noam Chomsky interview that we just did with Noam, Juan Gonzalez and I did a few weeks ago. And the other is we have some DVDs of the 20th anniversary event we had with Noam and Harry Belafonte. And Harry just turned 90 March 1st. Noam turned 88 on December 7th. And they had never spoken publicly together on a stage. And Juan and I sat with them, and it was truly a beautiful moment. And they each gave speeches. But I'd love to share that with you. And it's wonderful to be working with a cappella books. These are all sanctuaries of dissent. Whether we're talking this church, or WRFG, or People's TV, or independent bookstores, these are places that are so important for making dissent commonplace. So that when you're at work and you say something at the water cooler, someone doesn't think this is a threat and report you. Because dissent is what will save you, will save all of us. And we need a media that expresses all of this. So we'd love to talk to you. Get a book or get two or get one. Or if you have ideas and you don't want to stay around for show ideas or as time goes on, actions you want us to know about, email us at stories@democracynow.org. But at the UN, at the two marches, the 22nd and the 29th, the People's Climate March the 29th, and on the 2nd, the March for Science, which was just magnificent. So many young people, particularly girls, came out for the March for Science to talk about what it would mean if women took their place in the world of science. I talked to a 12-year-old girl who is suing President Trump and sued President Obama beforehand. They're part of a group of young people under 21 who are saying, you are threatening our futures. I mean, it is not only President Trump, but a foundation was built. I mean, under President Obama, while his first executive order was to close Guantanamo, for 8 years he didn't do that. Expanding the wars in the Middle East, and particularly expanding drone attacks from Somalia to Yemen and to other places. The number of deportations under President Obama, even his allies called him the deporter-in-chief. And so a foundation was laid. And President Trump has just taken it to a whole new level. It is very important that as journalists, we continue to pursue our mission, whether it is under a Democratic or a Republican president, or perhaps in the future, a president of another party. But among the signs of the March for Science, I think one of them said, ice has no agenda, it just melts. There was one that said, a sign that people were holding up that said, I'm with her with an arrow to Mother Earth. And then there was everyone's buttons that said, science, not silence. And I want to end back in World War II with a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And together with their professor and other students and workers, they decided to put out a series of pamphlets so that the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they put out 6 pamphlets. One of them was written on the cover, "We will not be silent." They distributed these pamphlets everywhere, under cover of darkness, in alleyways, in marketplaces, in schoolyards, and then they were caught, Hans and Sophie and their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy.